Greg hurried out of the cafe, the echoes of the general's words chasing him through the door like a relentless storm. He felt every pair of eyes on him as he left, his skin prickling with embarrassment. His once confident steps faltered, and the chill in the air outside did little to calm the heat of shame that now burned in his chest. He didn't dare look back. If he did, he knew he'd see the veteran still sitting there, calm and unbothered, and the general, with his eyes locked on him, condemning him with a gaze that cut through Greg like a blade. Outside, Greg stood on the sidewalk for a moment, his heart racing, and took a deep breath. The city carried on as usual, people walking by with no idea of the humiliation he'd just suffered. Yet, for Greg, it felt like the entire world had stopped to bear witness to his public disgrace. He hadn't even realized how deeply the general's words had stung until now. They echoed in his mind, each sentence replaying louder than the last. "You're not worthy to speak his name." Greg's fists clenched at his sides as he walked away from the cafe, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't seem to settle. The initial anger he felt had drained away, leaving him with a gnawing emptiness. All the confidence he had displayed, the superiority he felt mocking the man in the wheelchair, had evaporated the second the general confronted him. He found a bench further down the street and sat down heavily, staring blankly ahead. His mind raced, flipping between shame and confusion. Why had he said those things in the first place? Was it really necessary to humiliate that old man, to mock a veteran for no reason other than to feel superior? Greg had never really considered it before. He had always been quick to judge, quick to comment, quick to dismiss. In his mind, it had never been about hurting anyone. It was about making himself feel better. Yet now, he was the one sitting alone, humiliated. His thoughts shifted to the general's words, lingering on the realization that he had been utterly wrong. Sergeant Major Turner had probably been through more than Greg could ever imagine. But Greg hadn't even bothered to consider that. He'd simply seen a man in a wheelchair, wearing a tattered old jacket, and assumed he knew the entire story. What kind of person am I? He thought, his stomach turning. For the first time in a long while, Greg found himself uncomfortable with the answer. Back in the cafe, the tension from the confrontation began to ease, but the atmosphere remained different, heavier. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more subdued. The baristas behind the counter exchanged glances, and a few patrons whispered each other, their eyes occasionally flicking towards Sergeant Major Turner and the general seated across from him. The two men, though, seemed oblivious to the stares. The general leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, his face softening as he spoke to his old friend. "You handled that well, David," the general said, a faint smile on his lips. Turner shrugged, his weathered hands cradling his coffee mug. "I've dealt with worse. People like that aren't new to me." The general's expression darkened slightly. "Still, I don't tolerate anyone talking to you like that." Turner chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with a mix of humor and sadness. "You always were a little more protective than you needed to be, General. I've been insulted by better men." The general shook his head, the memory of the confrontation still fresh. "Maybe so, but it's the principle of the thing. That kid doesn't know what you've been through, what we've all been through. It's easy for people like him to sit there, make judgments, and act like they know anything about sacrifice." Turner sipped his coffee, his gaze drifting out the window. His eyes grew distant for a moment, as if he were seeing something far beyond the street outside. "Sacrifice means different things to different people," he said quietly. "Some people, like that kid, haven't been touched by it yet. Maybe one day he'll understand. Or maybe he won't." The general studied Turner for a moment, a hint of sadness creeping into his eyes. He knew that look all too well. It was the look of someone who had seen more than they'd ever wanted to, who had lost too much and still had to carry on. The general had seen it in countless soldiers' eyes over the years. But Turner carried it with a grace that few others could muster. "You've changed," the general remarked. "You've always been tough, but you seem, I don't know, more at peace now." Turner smiled faintly. "Age will do that to you. You learn to let things go, focus on what's really important." "And what's important to you these days, David?" Turner didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through him. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more reflective. Family, connection, the little things. He paused, then added, I've had enough battles for one lifetime, General. I just want to enjoy the time I have left. The general nodded thoughtfully. You've earned that much, David. No one deserves peace more than you. They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them, the café buzzed with quiet conversations, but neither man paid it any mind. They had spent years in the noise of war, and now the peaceful hum of everyday life felt like a balm to their souls. I never got the chance to tell you, the general said after a while, but I always admired the way you led your men. You were a damn good leader. Turner looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. I did what I had to do, just like everyone else. No, the general insisted, his voice firm. You went above and beyond. You saved lives, David. You brought men home who might not have made it otherwise. You're a hero. Turner shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. I'm no hero, General. I just did my job. Heroes are the ones who didn't come back. The weight of his words settled over the table like a shadow. The general didn't argue. He knew better than anyone that Turner's humility came from a place of deep understanding, a place only those who had seen war up close could ever reach. But it wasn't just humility. It was survivor's guilt. The general could hear it in his friend's voice, even now, all these years later. Before he could respond, a young woman approached their table, her face tentative but determined. She had been sitting near the front of the café and had witnessed the entire scene earlier. She clutched a small notebook in her hand, her fingers fidgeting nervously around the edges. Excuse me, she said quietly, her eyes darting between Turner and the general. I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you for your service. Both of you. Turner smiled kindly at her, the edges of his eyes crinkling with warmth. Thank you for your kind words, young lady. The woman hesitated, then added, What that guy said earlier, it was wrong. I just wanted you to know that most of us here, we respect what you've done. We're grateful. The general gave her a nod of appreciation. That means a lot. Thank you. She smiled, relief washing over her face, and then quickly turned back to her table. Turner watched her go, his smile lingering. You know, he said after a moment, it's not the insults that get to me. It's the ones like her, the ones who come up to us with gratitude in their eyes. It reminds me of why we did what we did. It reminds me that it was all for something. The general nodded. It's good to be reminded sometimes. As they sat there, the door to the café swung open again. Greg, the man who had made such a spectacle of himself earlier, stood in the doorway, hesitant, his face flushed. He looked around the room nervously, his eyes quickly locking onto Turner and the general. Greg swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to go away. Every instinct told him to turn around and walk back out, but something held him in place. His feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. He had spent the past half hour wrestling with the weight of his actions, the shame that had followed him out of the cafe. He had come back to try and make it right. Slowly, Greg walked over to their table, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He felt the stares of the other customers on him, but this time, it wasn't arrogance or a need for attention that pushed him forward. It was guilt. When he reached the table, Turner looked up, his expression unreadable. Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, but Turner's face remained calm, though his gaze was intense. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his throat dry. I shouldn't have said what I said. I didn't know. I didn't realize. His voice trailed off, the apology he had rehearsed in his mind falling apart. Turner studied him for a long moment before speaking. What do you know about sacrifice, son? Greg blinked, caught off guard by the question. I guess not much, he admitted, his voice shaking. Turner nodded slowly, his gaze softening just a fraction. That's what I thought. Greg shifted his weight, struggling to meet Turner's eyes. I didn't mean to. I just didn't think. That's the problem, Turner said quietly, his voice firm but not unkind. You didn't think. You judged without understanding. You saw a man in a wheelchair, wearing an old jacket, and you made assumptions. Greg's face reddened. I know. I was wrong. Turner held up a hand, silencing him. It's not about me. It's about what you represent when you speak like that. You're not just insulting me, or men like me. You're undermining the sacrifices made by every man and woman who's worn that uniform, who's given up a piece of themselves for this country. Greg's stomach twisted in knots. He felt small, insignificant in the presence of this man. I didn't realize how wrong I was, Greg said, his voice barely a whisper. Turner's eyes softened even more. What you do next is what matters. Greg looked at him, confused. Next, you've learned something today, hopefully, Turner said. But it's what you do with that knowledge that counts. Understanding sacrifice is about more than just saying you're sorry. It's about changing how you see the world, how you treat people. If you want to make it right, you start by changing yourself. Greg stood there, stunned by the simplicity and depth of the words. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak again. Slowly, he turned and left the cafe, his mind whirling, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He had come for forgiveness, but Turner had given him something more, a chance to change. As the door closed behind him, the general looked at Turner, his expression thoughtful. Think he'll take your advice? Turner smiled faintly. That's up to him. But I hope so. The general nodded, glancing out the window where Greg had disappeared. We all have to grow up at some point. Let's hope today was his moment. Turner raised his coffee cup, his smile broadening. To second chances. The general clinked his cup against Turner's. To second chances.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.